Hi, I'm Raj Vinakota, President at the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. Welcome, and thank you for joining us at CNS and the ECMC Foundation for this Career and Technical Education Month event. I'm pleased to have Peter Taylor, President of the ECMC Foundation, as well as 4 of our Higher Education Media Fellows, and my colleague, Frances Hannon, joining us today. The goal of CNS is to strengthen democracy for the long haul by cultivating people as well-informed, productively engaged, and hopeful citizens. Young people learn civic skills in a multitude of places. The high school civics class for sure, but also on the field, in clubs, on campus, in training, and at work. Here at CNS, we often talk about the fact that the workforce skills here in this 21st century and civic skills overlap considerably. How do you learn to work together in common cause, to empathize with others with different backgrounds and perspectives? How do you come together in teams and set goals? And how do you make sure that you work in a way that actually has a sense of purpose? All of these things are workforce skills, but they're also the skills that you need when you enter the public square. That is what makes this conversation so interesting. By expanding the conversation around post-secondary education and career options, we're making it so that young people and adults have the knowledge that they need to make informed decisions about what kind of school and career they pursue, and ultimately, what kind of life that they want to live and the larger role that they play in our democracy. So a thank you to you for spending this time with us. And I would like to especially thank one special person. Peter Taylor, who is soon retiring from the ECMC Foundation, has been a great partner in this and other work. The investment Peter has led at the ECMC can be thanked in part to this very conversation that we're hosting today. I'll let him tell you more about those investments, but I wanted to say, on behalf of all of us, thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you, Raj. I deeply appreciate those kind remarks. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on your location. At ECMC Foundation, we are committed to improving higher education for career success among underserved populations. Our goal is to see a country where all learners, regardless of the socioeconomic background, which neighborhood or zip code they grew up in, have access to quality educational and career opportunities and the necessary supports to succeed. I'm particularly excited to be part of this conversation today because, as Raj just mentioned, I'm preparing to retire as president of the ECMC Foundation at the end of this month. And CTE has been a focal point of my tenure at the foundation for several reasons. I joined the foundation as its first president in 2014 after a career in various fields, including various higher education institutions. And what I had seen over time was that the 4-year degree was the favorite firstborn in the world of post-secondary education, and it was almost like nothing else was really good enough. But that was just complete and total nonsense. You know, students who learn by doing, students who want to work with their hands, who are passionate about a particular skilled trade, had over time found themselves with fewer options. And I saw how these students, who want to solve problems, employ their creative side, or care for others, have been shoehorned into pursuing educational options that didn't fit their interests or career aspirations. And so ECMC Foundation became a champion of CTE because we felt we had the opportunity to have a dramatic impact on the field and on the lives of many, many people. And now, of course, we're emerging, finally, I think, from this pandemic into a thoroughly disrupted post-secondary education landscape. And while the declines in college enrollment may be stabilizing, the numbers are still below pre-pandemic levels, and high school students are questioning whether they need a degree at all. And add to that the fact that the population of young people leaving high schools is shrinking as demographics are shifting. All of this leads to a new paradigm. Today's students want an efficient means to an end, and CTE can offer them that. Meanwhile, of course, labor market needs are changing, right? There's a major shortage of qualified workers needed to fill middle skill jobs. And we've certainly seen these past few years have clearly shown that the creative, service-oriented problem solvers in middle skill positions have been absolutely essential to the basic functioning of our economy and our society, right? Workers in middle skill jobs have been essential for getting us through the pandemic. They've cared for our sick loved ones amid a grueling public health emergency. They've worked long hours supporting IT and cybersecurity needs. They fought fires. They've repaired our electric grid as severe weather and climate change have impacted large swaths of the country. And they've managed very complex, increasingly complex logistical challenges as our supply chain experiences ongoing disruptions. So middle skill roles requiring some education and training beyond high school, but not the full-blown 4-year degree, are really critical and account for more than half of the jobs in the United States. I think I recently read something from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that said that service technicians and allied health professionals were among the fastest growing professions in the country. The median wage for plumbers, pipe fitters, steam fitters is now nearly $60,000. Don't need a bachelor's degree to enter those professions, but a post-secondary education credential will position students for better paying jobs in these fields, especially if that credential is stackable and training can be leveraged along the path to promotions and higher paying supervisory kind of roles. Through high quality, equity centered post-secondary CTE, we can put millions of people on this path toward economic mobility. And frankly, to parry off Raj's comments about the importance of strengthening democracy. We think a lot about civic education, but CTE has a role to play too. Because if you want to strengthen democracy, you have to help people have a stake in its success. How do you do that? You make sure that they aren't on the outside looking in when it comes time to deal with the advantages and the growth and the opportunities that our economy provides. CTE is the way to help people have that stake. And so I'm very much looking forward to hearing from today's panelists, fine journalists who have actually all been a part of the ECMC Foundation Fellows through our CTE Leadership Collaborative. And through our partnership with the Institute for Citizen Scholars, we've been able to offer this higher education media fellowship to support journalists to increase the coverage of post-secondary CTE and post-secondary education writ large. I know we're going to have a terrific conversation. So with that, let me turn things over to Frances and we'll jump right in. Frances.
Thank you, Peter. I'm Frances Hannon. I am the Program Officer for the Higher Education Media Fellowship at the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. I am thrilled to have Peter joining us as a panelist for the remainder of the hour. I'm also pleased to welcome 3 of our Higher Education Media Fellows. We were supposed to have 4. We had one fellow who unfortunately couldn't make it, but joining us today is Lee Gardner, who is a senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education, Jason Gonzalez, who is the Higher Education and Legislative Matters reporter at Chalk Beat, Colorado, and Rebecca Koenig, an editor and reporter at EdSearch. As fellows, these terrific journalists each completed reporting projects related to post-secondary CTE, and we're going to drop the links to those great stories in the chat so you can check them out at some point later today. So following this moderated conversation, our panelists will take audience questions. So please drop your questions into the Q&A box throughout. Okay, so let's dive right in with an admittedly rather broad question. So in your reporting and your work, what have you heard that Gen Z or young people want out of college and career? What about adults who are either going back or retraining for degrees, or students from underserved backgrounds, including women and people of color? And how is this different from what you heard, say, 5 or 10 years ago?
I can start by talking about some things I've heard from young people. Thanks for having me here today. So for my project, I interviewed, I think around 9 students actually ended up in the piece across the country. They were all in high school at the time. And what I heard from them that they were hoping for from post-secondary options was something that would fulfill their sense of passion and purpose. Each of them, like, everyone, I think for the most part, really has big aspirations for their lives. They want to live lives that they consider to be good and fulfilling. And part of that is doing something that they really care about. I talked to researchers who sort of back this up, that young people are really optimistic and aspirational in general. It's sort of part of the developmental stage of being an adolescent. So they want to make a difference and they want training that supports that. At the same time, a lot of the young folks I spoke to realize that they face some barriers and they don't always know what exactly those barriers are, but they express a lot of fear and concern about succeeding once they get out of high school. So those are the two sort of main things that I think are in tension, at least among the folks I talk to, is wanting to like make a difference in the world and really live up to their potential, but also being worried about what they don't know, what they can't pay for, moving away from home, doing something that their families have never done before. So I'll start with that. Thank you.
I can jump in on the adult side since my project focused more on adults. In Colorado, we have a lot of dual enrollment and fifth-year high school options. So the high school students really get a lot of the CTE training and have the option for that in the state. But there's a group of adults in the state who really have never been exposed to that option. And so what I've heard from adults especially is efficiency, is how fast can I get something? How am I able to work around my work schedule, because it's hard to go to school and also balance family and work life. And so adults just want something that they can get to and through really quickly and be able to use that as an entry point for better pay, the ability to support their families better. And it depends a little bit on, the urban, suburban versus rural areas of the state. The urban, suburban, I really hear the efficiency side. Spent a lot of times out in the rural areas as well. And some of that's really just, we have a changing energy landscape in Colorado, especially. And so we're transitioning from mining and coal to a lot more solar jobs and a lot more thinking about how to support some of these communities across the state. So this is the idea in some of the rural areas of the state is really transitioning a whole community of people, a whole region of people to something that's different. And so, and while they're still able to work at the same time. So it's kind of efficiency on both sides, just a different way of talking about it.
Right, and to echo something that Jason brought up, there's this idea of efficiency. I mean, I spoke to a lot of students pursuing non-credit credentials, and I was struck, especially among some of the younger students who would more typically be the first-time full-time college students. They were not there to find themselves. They were looking very much for, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this for 2 months or 6 months or however long, and it's going to get me a job. But also, the public narrative about how much college costs and college debt has definitely worked its way down to these students. And, they were like, well, I'll do this and I won't owe all this money. I can do this and it'll be cheaper and I'll get a job and I won't have to do, 2 years, 4 years in college and owe all this money and I'll be ahead of the game. So despite all the misapprehensions about college costs, I think that the debt narrative has really made an impact on these students, which can be tricky because, I don't know how widely it's known, but, Pell Grants and other federal aid like that doesn't really cover, non-credit programs. So in a lot of cases, students might end up having to borrow for some of these programs.
So I'm hearing from each of you that there are both some fears about, say, paying for these degrees or the efficiency of getting this degree, say if you're an adult, but also this notion of, fulfilling passion and purpose, maybe more so from some of our younger students. And so, Peter, I wonder, have these things become more prominent in the overall narrative in the time that you've been working in this space? Or have they always been there to some extent?
I think they've become a little bit more prominent. As Lee mentioned, fewer and fewer students are going to college because they want to find themselves or discover their passion. They're really going to try to understand how can they elevate themselves in life. You know, the low-income student wants to figure out how to get the hell out of poverty. And, you know, what is it that's going to allow him or her to do that? And that's why, you know, this straight line kind of from CTE to that point is so critically important. I think more and more students are realizing that's a very, very viable pathway. Look, there was a long time when CTE had a terrible stigma associated with it, and sometimes deservedly so. You can look back many moons ago, you know, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and there was an attempt to track students there who weren't deemed college potential. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of these disciplines require a great deal of almost academic engagement. We support a carpentry program right here about a mile south of our office. And if you look at their 2-year curriculum, when they talk about kind of building that roof joist, the math they're using is actually what you'll see in trigonometry. So these are demanding programs. The challenge, of course, is providing the right wraparound support to help students get there. But it's interesting. I think more and more, I hope, not just students, but hopefully their parents, understanding these are very strong, viable pathways that should be considered. If somebody's objective in life is one day to be a cardiothoracic surgeon, terrific. We should celebrate that ambition. But there are a lot of students, let's face it, who are going to ultimately end up on the CTE pathway, and we ought to make it easier for them and socially acceptable for them at the same time.
So throughout your reporting, as you've met with students, met with faculty, parents, so the folks who are kind of in it in these programs who've bought in and enrolled, what are the perceptions that drive them into pursuing these programs, or the perceptions that they have on the jobs that they hope to get? Have you seen a shift in those at all from your reporting? Jason, I see you nodding, so I'm going to call you first.
I'm going to start by talking about this kind of in the bigger way of how the direction Colorado is going as a state, because we've done some big work with our strategic plan in the last month, releasing some of these things. So in terms of perception, with all of the things going on in the world, COVID, student debt conversations, all these things that really affect how students think about college, getting through college. The state has really started to think about what's the value to students? What is it going to be that individual sort of direction that they're able to take, and how can they get them into a training path or college education that leads to something? And that's really the perception that that drives the students is what does this lead to? And that's, I think, the conversation that CTE across the country has really led Colorado being in this place of thinking about where's the value in this, and where to that student, and what can they get after they get their certificate or their credential or graduate. So this is sort of leaked into all spaces of how students think about the value that they get, and how Colorado thinks about the value to the students. And that's what I hear the most from students is, where does this get me? What is the next step for me? Because they've either worked in these entry-level jobs for a very long time and they're just over it, and they want to move on to something else. They want to either use their brain more, or instead of just doing a cashier checking job, or they want more money for their family, and so that's what the state's thinking about in the value, and I think CTE has really pushed that conversation in the state.
I think one of the interesting things that I saw was that, and if any of the other panelists want to correct me if I'm mistaken about this, that a lot of CTE has been sort of siloed off from traditional academics, in the past. I spoke to one community college president who I asked him, well, about how many students do you have right now taking non-credit programs? And he didn't know. It was like, when a student comes in and, indicates their interest in non-credit, it was like, they just sort of shot them off to this other part of the institution and they went away. And I'm not saying that that president was callous or not well-meaning, but it just existed in a separate sphere. On the other hand, I definitely talked to students who were getting their CNA, a very, common and, for some people, very valuable nursing certificate, sort of a entry-level nursing certificate. And they definitely saw it as, well, I'm going to do this. And then, maybe I'll go for the next and go for the next and go for, an RN and work my way up. And I think that, students may in some cases be a little ahead of some institutions, although I definitely spoke to administrators who were seeing the value of putting, making better connections between the two sides of the house, so to speak, and better connecting credit and non-credit. And again, I've dealt a lot with the non-credit side, so that's kind of what I'm dwelling on now. So that those connections are there when and if a student comes back and wants to make that next step, because, as Peter pointed out, it's better for them long-term career-wise. They're not going to get very far just on that one certificate. And I think it's for the good of the students and the good of the institutions long-term if they can make those bridges stronger and more passable for the students.
Building on that, back to younger people, some educators I spoke with suggested that the kinds of categories that education and workforce systems and adults use to separate out these opportunities might make sense to people designing them, but not so much to the potential consumer or the potential student. Students want opportunities. In some cases, these distinctions do matter when it comes to financial aid and what employers care about. But, if you're 17, 18, 19 years old, you're not necessarily thinking to yourself, I want a 4-credit program that is accredited by this place that comes with X, Y, and Z. You might just want to know, I think what Jason said, what is my next thing? What's the next thing to do? What are all the choices? And so I think if you sort of laid out the options for young people differently than they tend to be offered, we might be surprised at what people pick and how they move through the system. But the system isn't really set up to be that friendly to a young person trying to make choices.
It's not friendly for adults trying to make those choices either. I just want to throw that out there. And Lee, I will not dispute you on that. It's hard to, get the houses together. And I mean, our technical colleges are sort of part of our system, but they're not part of our system, and they're completely full right now. So it's and we're looking at trying to expand. So it's it just shows what that perception as a state is and the perception as a student. Whether you're a high school student going back for more training from the fifth year programs that we have, or adults who are just trying to get something and move on to the next step.
I think part of the challenge along that point, Jason, about CTE, you have an example in your state where CTE programs are kind of bursting at the seams, full enrollment. They're a little bit more expensive to start up, frankly, and expand than if you were going to start up a program in history where you have one faculty member and 40 or 50 students in the class. Very often the equipment, material, supply require a tremendous upfront expenditure. And that's sometimes a bar that some states, some community college districts have a hard time getting over, but certainly well worth the investment once you get to a point where you're bringing students in on a regular basis.
So at the top of this, Rebecca was talking about the value that students are seeking. And so I'm going to ask the data question. What do we, as far as measuring ROI or measuring value, what do we know and what don't we know about career and technical education, and like these data points for people to base decisions on? And Lee, I'm going to let you take that one first.
Well, it depends. On the credit side, there's better data available because it's the credit side, so it's tracked a bit better, even though outcomes data, as with almost all outcomes data, is spotty. On the non-credit side, there's very little data available because almost no one keeps any data. The federal government does not keep it. It looked like they were going to start this summer, and then all of a sudden at the last minute, when they came to announcing rules for the new round of iPads, they said, no, maybe we'll make that optional, which maybe means probably no one will do it, or very few people will do it. Non-credit programs are not tracked. I did a big story about this. I was kind of shocked and frankly appalled. Some individual states, Iowa has been keeping very meticulous data about its non-credit students for about 20 years, and they're sort of the model for every other state. But every other state, for the most part, with a few exceptions here and there, it does almost no data tracking. And part of that is because there's no compulsion for them to track it. As I mentioned earlier, these programs aren't eligible for federal student aid. And so there's no money attached to them, no federal money. And so they're not compelled to track them. And so they don't, would be one simple, perhaps uncharitable answer. But I think at this point, people are starting to realize that would be a lot of value in at least knowing how many non-credit students you have. I mean, that was the genesis of the piece I did, was asking someone how many non-credit students you have, and them saying, well, I don't know. How big is your program and how much has it grown by over the last 5 years? Everyone keeps telling me it's growing. And they were like, I can't tell you. And considering that a lot of these programs, as Peter sort of alluded to, are expensive and can in fact be money losers for some colleges, depending on the program and the finances of the situation, that's kind of shocking. So, but Jason could probably speak to this. Colorado is working on it. Texas is working on it. People are starting to, get it going, but it'll be years before people have usable data about just basic student demographics, much less outcomes and things like that.
And we do have an ROI report, but as far as trying to break that down by demographics and by certain programs, can be pretty difficult. I look back at the adult conversation, especially, it's such a huge group that with many that don't have any sort of career training. And the hardest part about doing my reporting was that I really didn't have much data whatsoever on the adult population. So breaking that down can get really tricky, and we are working on really looking at how to beef up our data systems. We do have a lot of data systems. It's just getting more in place that can really track some of these in a deeper way.
One of the cohorts in our CTE Leadership Collaborative are to improve institutional research and data collection at community colleges around CTE, credit and non-credit. And so it's a slow process, but we think, if you can kind of build a structure by which, and a platform, by which community colleges can collect this information, you'll hopefully see it, blossom a little bit more. And that's the kind of data you need in order to kind of demonstrate either the value or the changes that need to take place before you can actually provide great value to students in accordance with our objectives.
And, it would be in everyone's interest to do this and do it well enough. It would be in the state's interest. It would be in the school's interest. It would really be in the students' interest. Some of these jobs, quite frankly, are not great jobs. And yet students keep getting credentials in them, and maybe not nationwide, but, locally, they might not be great jobs. And, I have examples of situations like that. But it would be in everyone's interest to do a better job with this. And yet it has been slow to happen. And there are reasons for that, but still.
I would point out one example of a place that's very, pretty obsessed with data, as far as I can tell, being Texas State Technical College, which is an institution that, as they like to brag, gets state support based on their outcomes data. Basically, either you deliver good outcomes for students or you're not getting your budget, which is not something that most colleges are looking, to change about themselves, I suspect. But they have a very interesting setup where they are continually talking to employers about what workforce needs they have, and then design, sort of working backwards from there to design their programs, their training programs. And they're sort of doing this continually. And so they're able to make the statement to students like, this program will pay off literally in your area. Here's the numbers. Like, this is what we can basically guarantee you. And one of the things they track is how alumni are doing for 5 years after graduation, calculating how much more money than minimum wage they earned during that period. And I don't think that's the kind of data many other places could produce for you if you ask for it. So that's just one example for folks who are interested in like somewhere that's doing this or paying a lot of attention to it. I would point you there.
And the Iowa people are happy to talk about data. They have like 50 different ways you can slice their data if you want to look at a larger system. So.
And Rebecca, it reminded me, here in Colorado, we have Colorado Mountain College, which is actually mostly outside of our system. And they have their own special tax district. They work, they really are accountable to the counties that fund them, the people that fund them. And so they work the most closely and are the most flexible in terms of figuring out that data. What's the return? How do I work with the workforce and ensure that what we offer is relevant to the employers and their future employees? So it's best bang for the buck.
Well, I'm curious, do any of the three of you have trouble accessing that data? I come from the research university space. I've often referred to myself as a recovering research university snob. But I know when I worked in that space, we were pretty good about institutional research and was part of a coalition of other research universities who paid a lot of attention to data, but were really reluctant to share it with anybody. So I'm just kind of curious, as you look at this space, do you find the same reluctance, or do you find people willing to engage?
If people have it, they've been willing to share it, but I can't even get a head count for the number of community college students in northeastern state that I won't mention, but it rhymes with Twinsylvania.
We have a lot of data systems. Most of that is reported out in reports. So, what outside of just CTE, just generally, student data. It's kind of institutionally held for in some instances, and a lot of that's crunched at the state side. And I mean, the state's willing to share much of that, but having it out there in the world is helpful for me. I think it's helpful for everybody.
Yeah, I will say it certainly doesn't seem to be readily available to someone considering whether to enroll or not. Some people on this panel, who have time and motivation to like track some stuff down. I think in some cases you can get it, but it's not consumer facing for the most part. And I think even if you sent that report to someone, making sense of it for their own personal use, I think would probably be difficult.
Okay, so before we've got some really wonderful questions that are coming through the Q&A. So before we kind of dive into those, I have two kind of lightning round questions for our journalists and a forward-thinking question for Peter. So for our lightning round, what tips do you have for other journalists looking to cover a career in technical education? And Rebecca, I'll start with you on that one.
Sure. Two tips. One, don't necessarily call it CTE or career in technical education. People don't necessarily use that phrase. It's not, people's eyes don't necessarily light up with recognition when you use it. So you might need to think about what you're calling this to get at it. And the second is talk to students and families. I feel like there's a pretty big disconnect between how students, and again, I'm speaking about the younger folks here, like how they're thinking and what they're looking for and what they're being offered in some cases. So just always talk to the people for whom these systems in theory are supposed to work.
Lee, what about you?
I will just, those are both excellent suggestions, and I will just compound the second one by saying any story that I do gets 50% better at least when I get up from my desk and actually go somewhere. So if it's, reporting by phone is sometimes the way you have to do things, but if possible, go out and visit and actually go talk to people in person and go take the golf cart tour, the inevitable golf cart tour, and but it makes a big difference seeing people. And a really good source for a story was not one of the people that a school that I visited had lined up. He was just like, "Hey, you want to talk to me?" And I said, "Sure." Yeah, that's good advice for almost everything, really.
I hate to sound like a broken record, underline, emphasize, highlight everything the two of you just said, especially the talking to students, getting to know the students and the challenges that they face. I think of one particular woman who I talked to, and you think you have an idea of all of the things that go into this, right? All the challenges, but as a state, we want to push more adults back into college who might not have finished, and just came upon, hey, this woman has a lot of debt and can't access any Pell money or any kind of finances to go back. So those are the type of things that you start to learn and start to realize that even if there's a well-designed program, there's other things that play into individual student decisions and family decisions that keep students from getting to something. So just talk to people and really get to know what they're going through.
Excellent. So I want to flip this a little bit. And for the three of you again, what about faculty, administrators, coordinators, maybe even local employers who have on the ground stories? How would you suggest they elevate some of those stories?
I think for a reporter, or for this reporter, the human story is most compelling. So let me come to your classrooms and see what's going on. Give me some names of people that I can contact. Give me the names of people who aren't your star student, but someone who's real, who has maybe a mixed experience or who's having challenges, but is persevering through them. So I would say, the closer you can put me in touch with the student or the educator, the more interested I will be. I could put it that way.
Please reach out to me. And then, yes, allow us that access to be able to see all of the different sides of things, because what one student's experience is still completely different for another one. So the more that we can visit and talk to people and just get to know every part of something, the better our reporting is going to be, and the better the stories are going to be.
I would say two things. One is tell me a story. I mean, I know you have to send out press releases and stuff about a grant and this and that, but tell me a story that makes me interested in telling that story, or one like it, or one related to it. And the other thing, and I say this all the time and people rarely take me up on it, is it's always good to hear about the great thing that worked. And we write those stories all the time, but maybe sometimes tell me about the thing that you're trying that you're not sure is going to work, and invite me to come be a part of that and watch it develop. And those are fascinating stories. And if it works, great. And frankly, if it doesn't work, then that doesn't mean that it was not worth trying, or that it wasn't worth writing about, because that can be fascinating and revealing too.
Excellent.
So I'm going to follow up on that, Lee, because it does hit a bit of a point for me about the connection between philanthropy and higher education. Because, and again, I was a university CFO in a public university system, and I was super careful about how we spent money. Public systems don't take risk aggressively for a lot of reasons, right? If things blow up and go wrong, you get your name in the paper or on TV, and people are embarrassed and careers are injured. But that's where philanthropy plays such an important role. We can take risk. I don't have to stand for election. I don't have to, answer to quarterly shareholders. We ought to be taking the risk at those campuses to help them experiment, help them try new programs. So in some ways, I would encourage you and all the journalists perhaps who are on this webinar to connect with philanthropy and say, tell us about the really innovative programs you're funding that frankly might not work, that might not succeed, that are kind of interesting, but a little risky. And try to tie in that with the institution that's implementing it, or the intermediary who's implementing it, and kind of see about one of the innovations that are being attempted that may or may not one day ultimately achieve its desired end. So if philanthropy is doing its job, they should be a source of great ideas for you, because if we only fund things that work, frankly, we should, in my opinion, that's philanthropic malpractice.
So I'm gonna, Peter, I would like to give you a moment. We've heard kind of from a lot of different perspectives as far as who these programs kind of touch, and the buy-in that you need from schools, employers, potential students, legislators, to kind of, in order to deliver on post-secondary CTE as a trusted path to a livable wage. And this is kind of, like I said, the big picture question that ECMC has been trying to tackle with some of its investments. So since you started this work, what kind of progress do you think has been made? And are there any bright spots that you see for the future, especially given kind of philanthropy's role in finding and seeding that innovation?
Bright spots. I guess I'll say, with the involvement from employers, educators, industry, new educational delivery models can decrease friction from training to workplace and reduce the overall cost and continue to improve outcomes. I think on the business side, in the last few years, we've seen almost exponential growth in some public-private partnerships with employers like Amazon or Boeing, focusing on community colleges as their prime talent provider. And these partnerships are very powerful for the community colleges and the employer and the student. So the college in those instances, I think, are better able to articulate a value proposition for the certificate programs for students, and the employer, of course, we think gains a competitive edge with skilled workers, and the students can easily communicate those competencies and attain a high wage career. We think legislators have been meaningfully engaged in learning about policies and practices, and I think that's a bright spot. We funded a program with the National Conference of State Legislators because there was sufficient interest amongst state officials in a variety of states to think about the connection between CTE and economic mobility programs. We have funded a couple of very exciting programs around the country, one at Northern New Mexico College, where we bring together higher education, unions, employers, and local government to prepare students in plumbing and pipe fitting careers. Also, the Northland Workforce Training Center, which is in Western New York, focusing on advanced manufacturing. Again, these are CTE community college programs. And so there are good models out there of programs that work that hopefully can be replicated and expanded down the road.
Okay, so our first audience question, this member of the audience would like to hear about instances and hopefully specific examples where you saw really good career ladders in some of the CTE programs that you may have encountered. They say we see pretty good ones in healthcare, but many of the other trade areas don't seem to have them as prominently.
Well, I was going to say healthcare. There are early efforts to here in California. Again, I'm most familiar with having been a trustee and a staff member and donor volunteer for a long time in California. Early efforts to try to better align some of those CTE programs at the community college with construction management undergraduate degrees. A number of Cal State campuses offer construction management as a 4-year bachelor's degree. So allowing that student at the community college level who's getting that 2-year program, in carpentry or plumbing or electrical, to then eventually come back maybe and stack that 2-year program with a 4-year program in construction management to get the bigger jobs, or maybe one day to become a general contractor. You see those starting to develop, but yeah, I was going to reference healthcare as maybe the best example.
Early efforts is the same in Colorado. I mean, we're still very much in a space where we're talking about students getting there. But a lot of the administrators I talk to and some of the focus on lawmakers is once you get them there, how do you continually keep them coming back for whatever that is? Healthcare is a great example of the ladders and the way that works for students, but how can that be replicated among other trades and skills that can then lead to maybe associates or a bachelor's or master's someday for that student, and they can get that over the course of their life. But we're not fully there yet, so it's we're just continuing to explore that right now as a state.
I've heard of some examples of community colleges, and I think even high schools, not just offering, for example, like a culinary arts program, but including some business management education as part of that, either entrepreneurship training or just like, you're going to learn how to be a line cook, but we're also going to teach you how to, do the inventory for a restaurant or something like that, sort of layering on top of one set of skills, another set of skills that is either immediately more lucrative or gives you the option to grow into more of a management position or even a business ownership position. And I've heard that discussed in, I don't think that we typically think of this as career and technical education, but in training early childhood educators, people who are going to work in preschools, which is often a quite low paying field, but there's a great need for people to do that work. And so, is there a way to not just prepare people to work as classroom instructors, but to own a successful daycare business? So I would just point to some of those places as places where there's high demand, relatively low pay, but the potential for you to be a business owner and not just, an entry-level worker.
I think that a lot of the manufacturing, and I forget what the AA degree that goes with that is, applied technology. I think that is becoming more of a ladder situation because that moves up into a VA as well. But I think a lot of those programs are tied a lot of times to a specific industry or even a specific set of employers in a region. I don't know how much that translates. Like you can get that here and you can go somewhere else. I mean, I suppose it transfers to some degree, but I don't know. But I think that sort of degree or string of credentials is moving more in that direction. That's not very specific, though, I will admit.
So another question about interviewing employers. And if you have done some reporting with employers, what could you share about the mindset of employers, specifically around traditional or exclusionary hiring practices that require a college degree for roles? Have there been any employers kind of leading the charge in changing that four-year degree requirement for hiring?
I have interviewed IBM several times for several different stories because I think that they at least would build themselves as a leader in creating opportunities for high-tech jobs that don't require a four-year degree. One specific way they're working on that is by creating tech apprenticeships, which are catching on somewhat in the US. It's a training concept that I think we more often associate with skilled trades, but there are places that are offering these technology or more like white collar apprenticeship programs, and IBM has some of them. Something that has been on my story list idea for a while, but I'll share it anyway, is employers have, I think, been promoting a lot of rhetoric around this, but it's not obvious to me how many people is Google, how many folks are being hired by Google who don't have a four-year degree? Like, just because Google says that's possible, is that really happening? And one reason I asked the question is I did a story a few months back coming out of a survey from the Society for Human Resources Management, which is sort of tangential to workforce and higher ed. But the survey was of the people who work in HR who do the hiring. And it turns out no matter what the people at the top of the company say, folks in HR are still looking for the four-year degree. So you have this situation where the executives perhaps are proudly saying, we're doing away with the paper ceiling, we're looking for people who have the skills, not the degrees. But if the folks in HR are not working that way, it doesn't change. So there's rhetoric, but how much the practices are changing, I think, is an open question.
People talk about the creep of jobs requiring that may not actually require a bachelor's degree to perform, being required to have a bachelor's degree to get the job. I think it's possible, this is just my surmise, that it may be happening the other way as well, where now that there are all these credentials and all these CTE credentials that you can't just go out and get a job doing whatever because you happen to be able-bodied and able to work. I spoke to an administrator at Western Alabama University, which is in the middle of this area where the big industry is timber. And apparently a lot of those jobs now require a credential. And I don't know how much of that is due to more technology being involved in it, and how much of that is just, well, we should get someone with a credential for this, as opposed to just someone who can work for 8 hours and knows how to operate a chainsaw without hurting anybody. And so, I don't know. I mean, and she was saying that there are now jobs in that industry that require bachelor's degrees that are not, not sweating jobs. They are. So I'm a little, not concerned would be the word, but I think that now that there are more credentialing opportunities available, it's not so much that people are ignoring credentials so much as they're just availing themselves of a wider variety of credentials to ask for, maybe.
Same as I'm hearing the same, Rebecca, and what do the hiring practices align to what the rhetoric is at the top? I don't know fully. I have heard examples that it has not, and the state and some business groups, business groups that work with education, such as Colorado Succeeds in the state, are really trying to get the business community more involved. So the rhetoric at the top matches what's happening for the student. So need to dig into that deeper, but it's I have heard generally the same.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. I'd love to pose this to all of you. Throughout your work in this space or your reporting in the space, how has your thinking changed about the traditional college pathway versus a CTE pathway? And if you want to venture any sort of advice that you've gleaned from that thinking, you can, but really curious kind of how your thinking about those two pathways has changed. Peter, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, I think my thinking has broadened, right? Again, I grew up where it was a 4-year approach or nothing. I've been, I think, in the last particularly 9-10 years, learned to think a little more broad than that. I think part of the challenge is, and I say this sometimes to parents, if it's your child, how are you going to have that conversation? Because there are a lot of parents who think you got to go to a 4-year school. And some parents are okay with the idea of starting in a community college and then transferring. But how do you have that conversation about what does your young son or daughter really want to do with their lives? And how does that mesh with the right pathway? And what are they really interested in? What are they passionate about? What do they really enjoy? And how do we make sure we get them on a pathway? Because if it's connected to something they're really excited about, they're much more likely to stay in school. And if they stay in school, they'll get some kind of certificate or degree, and that's better for everybody. So that conversation with parents and the parents with their children is something I think I've increasingly been thinking about and learning about.
There are options that it used to really be, hey, everyone. It's really changed the conversation of everyone, needs a bachelor's degree. Everybody needs to go to 4-year college. College for everyone. This is college, and it is higher education. It's beyond high school. So, I had this conversation with my nephew like 2 or 3 weeks ago. He's about to graduate, and it's like, well, what do you want to do? Because you don't have to go to a 4-year university, but there are things in between that really will make your life better. So find something that you want to do and go continue on with that, because in this state, in Colorado, if you have a high school diploma, it's really not going to get you very far. So the options of what's next, I've realized that everyone sort of needs to be thinking about that.
Thing that my thinking has changed about is that young people don't necessarily care so much about these categories, like I mentioned earlier. And they don't necessarily, even folks who really could use a well-paying job to change their life circumstances, that is not the only reason that they are making the decisions that they're making after high school. And I think that we are missing a big opportunity if we're not speaking to them about passion and purpose and serving their communities and leaning into their talents. What I heard over and over from them was a living wage is sort of like, obviously they want that, but they want so much more than that. And so I think it might be a little bit different than the rhetoric we offer adults. Not to say adults are only practical minded too, but just because a young person is going to have trouble paying for college or paying for any kind of training program doesn't mean that they don't have other priorities. So I would just encourage people to really listen to what young people want and work from there, because they want a good lifestyle, but of course they want so much more than that too.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time this past spring with one adult student. She'd gone back to school after being out of school for a long time. And it wasn't just, I'm going to do this and I'm going to get a job. She had a lot of things bound up in going back to school, and not just and not unrealistic things, but like this was about her life, and it was about her self-image and pride and a lot of things. She wanted a better life, but she wanted a better life was more than just more money, I guess you could say. And the other thing I guess I would say is I have a college age son. I have two kids, but one of them is college age now. And he's going to school right now. And, I don't know if he feels like this is exactly how he feels he's best using his time. I don't know if he feels like he has figured out what he wants to study, and if he wants to not go back in the fall or something like that, and wants to do something that's more along the lines of CTE, as long as he doesn't want to get a CDL, then I'm not going to have a problem with that, as long as he has a good plan, because this is as good a path to a good life as any other, as long as you have your wits about you. I think that I didn't have a bad view of CTE before, but I have a lot of respect for the people who do this work, and a lot of respect for the people who often make a lot of sacrifices to take this route.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for this rich and wonderful conversation, for our panelists for joining us, and for all of you who joined this webinar. So thank you very much. All right.